Man, we love baby dedications at Canvas Church. It's not just a commission to those who are standing on the stage, it's a reminder to those of us who are sitting in the audience of the responsibility that Jesus has given us as parents to raise our kids to know and love Jesus. If you're a guest with us, I just want to say welcome. So glad that you're here today. My name is Nate. I get to serve on the team at Canvas Church, and really pumped to jump back into part 8 of our series called True Blessings, a cultural critique. We've been, obviously, part 8, we've been working our way through this for the last 8 weeks. Got a couple more on the docket moving forward. Excited about those. The reason why we jumped into the Beatitudes and to walk through this cultural critique is to listen to the words of Jesus. Jesus, as he came to earth, he ushered in his kingdom, meaning he brought heaven to earth, and he was inviting people into a relationship with him. Those who would be in relationship with Jesus, they are a part of two kingdoms. They're a part of a heavenly kingdom, and they're part of an earthly kingdom. And Jesus sat down with his disciples, followers of his. This isn't just the 12 disciples, but this was all who were following after him at this point. And he begins to have a conversation with them about what it looks like to be a part of his kingdom. It's all encompassed in this, what's called the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through Matthew chapter 7. In fact, at the beginning of 2024, we're coming back to the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to work our way through the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. But we decided that in the fall, we were going to take the first 10 weeks to talk about the first 8 statements that Jesus makes in this sermon. Really, where he is kind of giving an overall or a summary or these 10 quick statements of Beatitudes or supreme blessedness. These are supreme blessings that when you look at these blessings that Jesus says, these people who live like this are blessed people, it is a cultural critique because anybody in Jesus' day and people in our day, you look at these blessings that Jesus lays out and you think to yourself, well, that doesn't seem to be actually very blessed. Like, I would rather avoid some of the things that Jesus points out in this text that doesn't feel like a blessing. And what we've been trying to do is understand from a biblical perspective what Jesus was trying to communicate so that it would critique us personally, individually. I know when we see a cultural critique on the screen in a church, we think to ourselves, awesome, we're going to talk about all of the ways that the world is all jacked up and the way culture is messed up. And I just have never found that that's a very productive way to read the scriptures. To read it so that I could point out all of the ways everybody else is getting things wrong. I would rather read the scriptures and let the scriptures read me and point out to me the ways in which I need to be more shaped in the likeness of Jesus. And that's what we've been doing as we've been working our way through the Beatitudes or these supreme blessedness. As we have every week, we're going to start off by reading the Beatitudes in their entirety. And again, we've read them week after week so that we would get familiar with these, that these words would get planted in our hearts or rooted in our hearts so that they would produce fruit in our lives. So, Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. Let's jump in. This is what it says. One day, as he saw the crowds gathering, and Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice or for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad. For a great reward awaits you in heaven, and remember the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. This morning, we are tackling this beatitude that God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. God blesses those who work for peace. That's a very telling statement, isn't it? Those who work for peace. It communicates what we already know about life, and that is peace is not easy to come by, is it? Man, peace is a very difficult thing to get as we look at the landscape of our world. It's easy to see that there's not a lot of peace. As you see maybe the landscape of the company that you work for or the work environment you find yourself in, maybe there's a lot of tension and not a lot of peace there. Maybe even this morning as you were making pancakes before you came to church today, there was a lot of unrest inside of your home. Why? Because peace is a very challenging thing to work for. Like, you have to work for peace. When the Bible says, where Jesus says to work for peace, what he's telling me, what I'm hearing when I hear those words is this: peace isn't something that you and I are going to stumble into. We're not going to wake up and all of a sudden there's just peace everywhere. Peace to be had all over. Like, you scroll your social media feed and you're like, all this is peace. It is so wonderful. Like, peace is not something that we're going to trip into. We're not going to stumble into. It's something that we're going to have to work for, especially if we're talking about biblical peace. Biblical peace, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. The Greek word for peace is irene. And this is what it means. It means complete wholeness in every area or every arena of life. This means peace with us and God. Like, that relationship is we're in right relationship there. And when we're right relationship there, the vertical relationship, then all of a sudden the horizontal relationship is right as well, so that I have like right relations with the people in my home. And I'm in wholeness and there's completeness in the relationships, people in my neighborhood. All the way down to there's right relationships or there's peace or wholeness, all the way down to the way nations treat nations. This is the kind of peace that Jesus talks about when he says, blessed are those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. We have got to work hard for peace. We have to work hard for peace in our homes. We have to work hard for peace in our neighborhoods. And man, to think about peace of the nations, that's a bit mind-blowing, right? Feels like each and every one of us are just a drop in the bucket of what can be accomplished. But this is what I know to be true. If I'm not working for peace in my home, likely I'm not working for peace in my neighborhood. And if I'm not working for peace in my neighborhood, then likely I'm not working for peace for the greater of humanity in nations as well. So this peace that Jesus talks about, this working peace, this isn't something, friends, that we are just going to stumble our way into. And real fast, before we go on, I just want you to think, just real quick, like take 10 seconds or so. If you're taking notes, you could even jot this down. I just want you to think about real quick, like one of the places that you would love to see more peace. Like, you survey your life and what's an area that you would love to see more peace in your life. Go ahead, take 2, 3 seconds, 5. Think about it. Where do I want to see more peace? I'm guessing most people around here, you at least have like some idea of an arena or an area of your life that you would love to see more peace in. And I want you to know this morning as we jump into the rest of this. Jesus wants peace there as well. Whatever you identified in your life that you would like to see more peace, maybe again it's between a neighbor, a coworker, a family member, like wherever you want to see more peace. Good news this morning. Jesus wants there to be more peace there also. And check this out, newsflash. That's probably why he has you there. Like Jesus has you in the environment that he has you in because he wants you to bring peace to those situations. That's why Jesus sits down with his disciples and begins to talk them through these characteristics, these attributes, because he's getting ready to launch them out into the world, and they are going to take a piece of heaven with them wherever they go. Wherever followers of Jesus are, Jesus is there also. And wherever Jesus is at, he wants to bring peace to that situation. So what that does is it then puts the onus on each and every one of us that we should be doing our part to answer Jesus' prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So that when we go back out into our worlds, whatever that looks like, that we can bring a piece of heaven with us and we can bring peace into these situations, the kind of peace that Jesus wants us to bring. As we've been doing throughout this series, we try to point at another passage in the scripture, another story, something to help kind of bring shape and context to these declarations of supreme blessedness. And this morning we're going to look at Luke chapter 6, verse 12 through 16. That's our text for this morning. Jesus has been doing ministry for some time. At this point, he's been doing miracles that's gathering a lot of people's attention. He has a lot of people following after him. There's quite a crowd that gathers around Jesus wherever he shows up at. There are some people that he has individually and personally invited to follow after him and to join him. So this is kind of the context or the backdrop behind this passage. Verse 12 in chapter 6 of Luke says this: "One day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. And at daybreak, he called together all of his disciples, and he chose 12 of them to be his apostles." You see, there was a great crowd of people following Jesus at this point in his ministry, and he wanted to narrow it down to the 12 that he would call apostles. We oftentimes use these terms synonymously: disciple and apostle. Disciple is anybody who is following after Jesus, being shaped into his image and his likeness. That's what a disciple is. If you're here this morning and you are a follower of Jesus, you are a disciple of Jesus. So there was a lot of disciples at that point, a lot of people following Jesus, and Jesus was going to narrow it down to the 12 apostles. These are the ones that Jesus was going to hand over leadership of the church when he ascended back to be with the Father. He was going to hand over the leadership of the church to these 12 apostles, and then they were going to go plant churches throughout Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That's what the book of Acts tells us. So this is the moment after Jesus spends all night long praying, God, which one of all of these people, which ones are going to be my apostles? I love that when Jesus has important decisions to make, that he spends time with the Father. He spent all night praying, God, who is it? Father, which ones? And then we have the list. Here are their names: Simon, whom he named Peter; Andrew, Peter's brother; James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus; Simon, who was called the Zealot; Judas, son of James; and Judas Iscariot, who would later betray him. You're probably wondering at this point, what does this text have to do with peacemaking? Like, it's so random, right? Like, what does this list of names have to do with peacemaking? I don't get it. This seems like such a random text, but inside of this list of apostles, we find that Jesus didn't just talk about being a peacemaker. As we look through the New Testament, we see that Jesus didn't just model what being a peacemaker looked like, although he did. In fact, if there was ever a model of what peacemaking looked like, Jesus is the role model. Like, he is the benchmark, he is the standard. It gets no better than Jesus. He is the God, invisible God made visible to man. Perfection at peacemaking. So Jesus didn't just talk about being peacemakers. Jesus didn't just model being a peacemaker. Inside of this list of 12 names, Jesus proved to us that it is possible for those who are followers of his to be peacemakers. This isn't just an idea. This isn't just a concept. This isn't just a nebulous thought that it doesn't have any handles to. Inside of this list of names, we see that it is possible for the followers of Jesus to be peacemakers in our world. Let me explain. Inside of Jesus' 12 apostles, you've got a couple of guys who are very noteworthy on this topic of peacemaking. Number one, you have this guy named Matthew, who was the tax collector. Matthew, like if you read this into the context of like an MMA fight or a boxing match, like you got Matthew, the tax collector, in one corner. He's in the blue trunks, okay? And then in the other corner, you have Simon the Zealot, and he is in the red trunks. These two, they came from complete opposite sides of the track. These guys came from different sides of the aisle politically. Like, use whatever contrasting idiom you would like to use about these guys, and they are your poster boys for what it looks like to be completely opposite from one another. You have a tax collector and you have a zealot. Tax collectors and zealots in the first century, they were incompatible companions. They had nothing in common with each other. In first century Jerusalem, Roman-occupied Jerusalem, these two people would be at complete odds with one another, absolutely, fundamentally. They weren't just incompatible with each other, they were actually in opposition with one another, constantly coming in combat with each other, and this is why. In Matthew, you have the tax collector. Matthew is a pawn. A zealot would have thought of them as a pawn of the Roman Empire. Tax collectors in Jesus' day, in first century Jerusalem, or Roman occupied Jerusalem, tax collectors were used by the Roman Empire to go exploit the people for taxes. And this is how a tax collector would make their money. They would go out, they would collect whatever was for Caesar, and then whatever they could add on top of that, that was their salary. So they were constantly ripping off and exploiting the most vulnerable in their community, and that's why tax collectors were absolutely despised in their day. And then you have Simon the Zealot. He's a Jewish nationalist. He absolutely despises the fact that Rome is occupying Jerusalem and they are the ones in control and in power. They can't stand it, and they're bringing an uprising. They are resistors to Rome and Roman rule. They can't stand it. So you have Matthew, who is a sympathizer and collaborator with Rome. And then you have Simon the Zealot, who was a militant resistor of Roman rule. These guys were polar opposites from one another, completely at odds with each other. And after a night of prayer Jesus spends with the Father, these two guys make it on the A team. These two guys make it into Jesus' inner circle, those whom he was going to hand over the keys of leadership of the church to. Like, these are the two guys. So Jesus' closest followers, they know what it's like to have to work for peace even on his team. I can imagine how tense some of the conversations must have been between Matthew and Simon. I can only imagine. At times it probably felt like eggshells they were walking around on, because this is like ready to explode at any time. And Jesus invites them into relationship to prove, at least in part, to prove to you and I that peacemaking is possible for those who are followers of Jesus. Now, peacemaking isn't about being nice or being tolerant in terms of our nowadays use of those terms. Just being nice, just placating, just being tolerant, right? The new tolerance is intolerance, isn't it? Like that's just a reality in the day that we live. Like when Jesus says be a peacemaker, he's not talking about being nice or being tolerant in today's definitions of those terms. What he's talking about is actively bringing peace to an unpeaceful situation. That we are working towards bringing peace. Scott McKnight in his the Storybook Bible commentary, or the Story of God Bible commentary rather, this is what he has to say about it. He says, the peacemaker, as the person whom Jesus blesses, seeks to reconcile, not by pretending there are no differences or by suppressing the differences, but by creating love for the other that transcends or that permits people to join hands despite or in spite of differences. Let me read that one more time. It's a mouthful. The peacemaker is the person whom the peacemaker, as the person whom Jesus blesses, seeks to reconcile. That is their desire, to reconcile. Not by pretending there are no differences or by suppressing the differences, but by creating a love for another that transcends or permits the people to join hands in spite of differences. Let me say it another way this morning. Peacemaking is about prioritizing people. Peacemaking is about prioritizing people. One more time. Peacemaking is about prioritizing people. And I know that, there's great alliteration there. That's easy, rolls off the tongue. You can write it down. We can nod our heads in agreement about that. But then when it comes down to the real practical nature of prioritizing people, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where this peacemaking becomes real challenging for me, and I'm going to guess for you as well. For example, what do I mean by prioritizing people? Let me give you a few examples. Prioritizing people over your preferences. Oftentimes, we turn our personal preferences into biblical mandates, but the Bible never mandated those things. So they become our pet preference, and we assume that because it's our preference, it should be everybody else's preference as well. And we can treat people really poorly when we elevate our preferences, can't we? That plays out in a myriad of different ways inside the church, but just to paint a little bit of a picture, in the songs that we sing, in the translation of the Bible that we use, in the holidays that we celebrate or we don't celebrate, right? We can prioritize our preferences over the top of people. I won't ask you to raise your hand about this, but just think through, have you ever been in a conversation like you started the conversation, or you just ended up in the conversation about somebody's preference around Halloween, which happens to be coming up soon. And people get really passionate about their preference on this one holiday. And that's fine. You have your preferences. Hold passionately to them. But prioritize people over your preference. So when I say peacemaking is about prioritizing people, that's what I talk about, prioritizing people over preferences. Or how about this? Prioritize people over, wait for it, your politics. In case you didn't know, 2024 is coming. It's going to be a year. It's going to be a year that we've all been dreading for the last 4. It's coming. It's coming. And I see people that I love, people that I care about, divide and devour each other over their politics. And when Jesus says prioritize people or bless, I'm not going to say that Jesus said that because that's what I said. about what Jesus said. Jesus said, God blesses those who work for peace. And that means prioritizing people over your politics. Doesn't mean that you can't have and hold a political position. But what does it look like? What will it look like in 2024 if we as a church, let's just look at us, like we as a church, if we prioritize people over our politics, that we leaned into relationship rather than divide and devour one another over our particular politics. I think Jesus would be glorified in that. I think this next coming year is a great opportunity for us to work towards being peacemakers as a faith community. Rather than walking back in the same ruts that we always find ourselves in, let's carve a new way. Let's carve a way that Jesus carved out for us by being peacemakers. Being peacemakers. Or how about this? Peacemaking is prioritizing people. It means that you prioritize people over positions. Prioritize people over positions. Having a position where you stand on a particular subject or matter is important. It's absolutely important. We need to have biblically informed positions. We have to. Equally as important is to also have a posture. The way I interact because of the position that I hold. So having a position is important. Please don't hear me say this morning that we shouldn't have any positions in this place. We absolutely have to have positions. But what is equally important is we have a posture by which we present those positions to the people around us. And I'm going to use a conversation that we're having culturally. It seems to be at the forefront of every conversation that we have culturally to illustrate this point. And it's the conversation that we're having as a culture around gender and sexuality. This is a preeminent conversation of our day. It is happening on the regular. Maybe if you don't find yourself particularly in environments where the conversation is happening, I guarantee you that it is happening in our middle schools. It is happening in our high schools. Our teenagers are thinking about this topic. This is something that's going to come up over and over again in the next election cycle because it will be a main topic of conversation. Gender and sexuality. What does it look like to have a position and a posture when it comes to gender and sexuality in 2023? It's a question that we've got to understand. It's something we have to be informed on. It's something we have to know for ourselves. So the position is important. Me personally, and as a church, the position that we take on gender and sexuality is a biblical position. It's a biblical position. Hold a worldview of gender and sexuality that is shaped by the scriptures, by what God teaches us. That gender and sex are synonymous terms. There aren't 72 or 107 or an infinite amount of genders. God said, let us make man, Adam, humans, let's make them in our image and our likeness. So what did God do? He created man and he created woman. So for us humans to understand the nature of God requires two genders, both male and female, to even begin to get a grasp of the complexity of who God is. In the beginning, God created them male and he created them female. So in terms of gender, the scriptures are very clear about this, very clear. And in terms of sexuality, now how do we live out based on our genders? How do we live this out in a sexual relationship? Well, the Bible is also very clear about that. Is that sexuality is meant for, it is a gift. in the covenant relationship of marriage between a man and a woman. A covenant relationship that is others focused. My affection, my attention, my love should be for Heidi and want the best for her. It's not a selfish covenant relationship of marriage is not a selfish endeavor. It's a self-giving endeavor. So sex was a gift created by God for the context of a covenant relationship called marriage between a husband and a wife. Now, even inside of the covenant relationship of husband and wife, we can still dishonor God sexually. We can do it when we turn in and we begin to try to gratify self-behavior rather than give ourselves away in love towards our spouse. That's a biblical position. And I know that maybe you're going, whoa, that's a pretty emphatic statement. Listen, I've read both sides. I've spent well over 100 hours studying book after book, podcast after, I think I pretty well understand both sides of this conversation. And in order to make the Bible say something, then those two things is to make the Bible say something that the Bible does not say. There are people who do it, for sure. But it's to make the Bible say something the Bible does not say. So that's a position. It's very clear, right? I'm going to hold to what the scriptures tell us about both gender and sexuality. As uncomfortable as that might be, as much as I might want to push against that and I might want to reject that and I might want to rebel against that, the Bible is clear and we need to follow. That is a clear position. But then what about posture? It's one thing to have a clear position and stand up on a soapbox and shout it to everybody around us, let them know how wrong they are. But our posture is just as important as our position. The way we present our position, it absolutely matters. In fact, I would say this about posture and position. Position sometimes is the easiest thing to come to. It's the posture that really takes hard work. It's the posture that really is going to take intentionality as we posture ourselves in this conversation. Are we doing it so that we can be a help to the world around us? Or are we just simply shouting in a vacuum all of our positions? So the posture, I have a position, it's biblical. And the posture that I want to have is empathetic. A biblical posture or a biblical position and an empathetic posture. An empathetic posture is this. It's recognizing that there are an increasing number of people, teens in particular, who are confused about gender and sexuality. They're confused about it. I've been in seasons of my life where I was confused. I didn't understand. I didn't know what was going on. The last thing I needed is somebody was screaming at me, telling me that I was wrong. What I needed was somebody who had some empathy, recognizing they too had been confused. Bring them along, help them to better understand. So there is an increasing number of people who are confused about gender and sexuality in our society. And not just that, there's a small percentage, in fact, it's less than 1% of people who deal with what's called gender dysphoria. It's a clinical diagnosis where there's incongruence with how they feel and the sex that they were born. And it is important for me as a follower of Jesus to enter into conversations with people whom God loves, who are wrestling with that fact. Maybe I've never had to wrestle with that, but I've wrestled with plenty when it comes to sexuality. And to see them as people and empathize with the fact that they may be confused or they may be dealing with something that's clinical in nature. And that allows me to step into that conversation with empathy, not just parading around my positions. And then, in the context of that, now we can start to have a real conversation. Maybe let me frame it like this. This might be helpful for you this morning. Love isn't affirmation, and disagreement isn't discrimination. Love isn't affirmation, meaning I can love somebody who has a different understanding of both gender and sex without affirming their position. I can do that. Jesus did it all the time. In fact, he attracted groves of crowds of people, so many you can't even count, because he was able to do that. Love isn't affirmation. And then on the flip side of it, some of you, the thought process is that unless you affirm, you cannot love. And that's just simply not true. That is a false dichotomy that our culture is trying to create for us so that we will divide and devour one another. It's not true. You can love without affirming. And disagreement is not discrimination. You and I can disagree on a lot of things, and it doesn't mean we're discriminating against one another. And while we live in a culture that wants to polarize and politicize every issue known to man, Jesus calls us, those who are his followers, he calls us to be peacemakers. Peacemakers. And friends, that concept punches both left and right. Nobody gets out of the way of those punches of Jesus. Because if you look at the landscape, none of us are good at being peacemakers, which gives us an incredible opportunity to show the world around us a different way, a third way, the way of Jesus, where we step in and we become peacemakers. And in order to be peacemakers, we have to know who peacemakers are. For the rest of our time this morning, I'm going to walk through 3 truths about peacemakers that will help us become peacemakers ourselves. Truth number 1 is this: peacemakers are people who are reconciled to God. Starts there. Peacemakers are people who are reconciled to God. Superiority is one of the surest ways to sideline peace, isn't it? You walk into a conversation thinking you are all that and a bag of chips. Whoever's on the other side, they are not going to listen to a thing that you have to say. Superiority is one of the surest ways to sideline peace in our lives. But check this out. The universal need for reconciliation should suppress all superiority in humanity. When we see other human beings, maybe they're sinning different than you would sin. Maybe they're sinning different than you are sinning. But you recognize that they too are just sinners in need of reconciliation to God. All of a sudden, the walls come down. It is the universal leveling of the playing field when we recognize that all humanity needs reconciling to God. So peacemakers are first and foremost those who have been reconciled. They are now in right relationship with God because of the work that Jesus did on the cross. That's the beauty of reconciliation. It's not a work that you and I do so that we can boast how incredible we are. It's a work that Jesus did for us and offered as a gift to us so that when we look at the landscape of humanity, we recognize we are all in the same boat. We all need to be reconciled to God. And that should strip away any superiority that we feel, any self-righteousness that we feel because of our righteous actions. It should strip us clean of those so that when we see humans, we see humans who need to be reconciled to God. The second truth about peacemakers is this: peacemakers are people who know God is for peace. God is for peace. And I know, I've been around this conversation enough times. There's a handful of you in here right now. And as soon as I said, peacemakers are people who know God is for peace, this is what you said in your mind, not out loud. At least I didn't hear you. You said, but what about Jesus in the temple? Didn't he fashion a whip? Didn't he turn over tables? Didn't he go over there? Like, yes, he did. He did. And he was God. And you are not. And he can be trusted to handle that moment. I cannot. God can be. I can't be. But you cannot read the scriptures cover to cover and come away without understanding this, that God is the God of peace. He is a God for peace. And just in case you weren't going to believe me at my word, I figured I'd grab a scripture for your benefit. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. This is where Isaiah prophesies a ton in the book of Isaiah about the Messiah. And this is what he says. And this is so fitting because we're coming into the Christmas season. For a child is born to us, a son is given. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all of eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of the heavens' armies will make it happen. He is called Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And his government and its peace will never end. What was Jesus doing when he sat down on the mountain and began to teach people? He was teaching them what it looked like to be a part of his kingdom. What kind of kingdom is that? Well, according to Isaiah, it's the kind of kingdom that his government and its peace that he brings with it will never end. In fact, when the angel showed up and talked to the shepherds, let them know that the Messiah had been born, they broke out in praise. What did they say? Say, glory in the heavens, peace on earth to all whom his favor rests. There's no question about this point. God is the God of peace. And the third point is this: peacemakers are people who seek reconciliation with others. So, peacemakers are those who are reconciled to God. Peacemakers are those who recognize that God is the God of peace. And because of those two things combined together, the outflow of that is peacemakers are people who seek reconciliation with others. Followers of Jesus must desire peace. That must be our position. We have got to desire peace. They must turn from revenge and retaliation towards reconciliation. It is a non-negotiable. It's non-negotiable for those who are followers of Jesus, that we turn away from retaliation, we turn away from revenge, and we walk towards reconciliation with others. And I have 3 ideas that you can pop around in your mind this week. In fact, maybe you have some of your own and you'd love to shoot them at me. Feel free to do that. We'd love to hear from you. But here's 3 ways that I feel like we can be better peacemakers this next week, this next month, this next year, and on for the rest of our lives. Number 1 is this: remember, every person bears the image of God. Every person that you come in contact with, whether you like them or dislike them, whether you love them or despise them, every person that you come in contact with was made in the image of God. Imago Dei. They bear the image of God. And when that is our starting place while interacting with people, the barista that got your coffee wrong, the Amazon company that sent you the wrong package, the small appliance repair guy that's now been out 4 times because he or she still just can't get the job right. Like whoever it is, when you start with recognizing that person was created in the image and likeness of God, it should adjust the way you interact with that person. I think you'll become more of a peacemaker rather than a disruptor in those moments. Because everybody is made in the image and likeness of God, whether they hold your politics, your positions, or your preferences. They were made in the image and likeness of God, and they should be treated that way. Number 2, inform yourself with credible information, not for ammunition, but for understanding. Like as you walk through a topic, as you walk through your position on any given topic, that you give yourself well-informed, like credible information about the topic. Not so that you can holster a whole bunch of arguments so that you come in like ready to, like guns a-blaring. But so that you better understand where they are coming from. What is their position? In fact, I've heard it said that until you can charitably argue the other side of the position, you probably have no business sharing your side of a position. So seek just information, just some understanding around it. In fact, just to back up the conversation a little bit, trying to nail down my position on gender and sexuality made me engage in ways and try to understand better what is going on there. And that's where I became empathetic with those who wrestle with that in their life. It was seeking to understand, informing myself so that I could speak charitably on either side of the topic. Again, not for ammunition, but for understanding. And then the third is this: dialogue, debate, disagree, but do it all agreeably. Do it all agreeably. One of the things that will erode our culture faster than anything else is when we stop dialoguing, robust debate, and we stop disagreeing with one another. Friends, it's a problem when we stop disagreeing with one another. But what's a bigger problem is when we do all of those, but we don't do any of them agreeably. That somebody on the outside looking in would say, man, that person is a very angry person. Like, what would it look like in the next year? Think about it. We have a prime opportunity to put this into practice, 2024. Here we go. Where we dialogue, we debate, we disagree, but we do it all agreeably. Man, I think we're going to carve a new way forward. If we could have the worship team come at this time. And as they come, as we have again every week in this series, we've tried to think about whoever is communicating, somebody personally in our lives who models this in a way that has impacted. And for me, as I was surveying the landscape of people in my life, the person that came to my mind when it comes to peacemaking is my beautiful bride, Heidi. By nature, she's a peacemaker. There's no doubt about it. She's just wired into her. Sometimes I'm jealous about how well she does at peacemaking. But her peacemaking isn't just simply hardwired into her. See, I've had a long time now, almost 26 years of marriage, 4 years, like 30 years. I had to do the math there. So 30 years of watching her wrestle through what does it look like to be a peacemaker? What does it look like to disagree with somebody and still love them? I've watched my bride forgive even when she didn't trust. See, we conflate those two things, forgiveness and trust. Those aren't one and the same things. I've watched her forgive when she didn't trust. I watched her set up boundaries and not barricades. Boundaries, they have the ability to move and shift and mold as necessary. Barricades are like, you've done me wrong, you're out. There's no coming back. I've watched her set up boundaries and not barricades of the people around her. I've watched her wrestle with how to love without affirming or condoning unhealthy behaviors and choices. And I've seen her do that not just in periphery people, not just with acquaintances. I've seen her had to do it with her family, the closest people to her, the ones who raised her. I've watched her wrestle down, Jesus, what does it look like to honor you with my mom and my dad? And she's done it beautifully, imperfectly, no doubt, but beautifully. And why does she wrestle with it? It would be so easy just to say, forget it. We're done. She does it because she knows that Jesus has called her to be a peacemaker. So she steps into that. Luke, I'm going to close with this scripture. Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 36. Because this, friends, puts an exclamation point on what we've been talking about. And this is what Jesus says, Luke records. But to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek also. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give to anyone who asks, and when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. If you love only those who love you, why should you get any credit for that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to only those who do good to you, why should you get credit? Even sinners do that much. And if you lend money only to those who can repay you, why should you get credit? Even sinners lend to other sinners for a full return. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will truly be acting as children of the Most High, for He is kind to those who are unthankful to the wicked. You must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. Would you stand to your feet this morning? First takeaway, same takeaway all week, all series long. Second takeaway, super simple. It's going to be difficult. Find ways this week to be a peacemaker. Find ways to be a peacemaker. What situation can you bring peace to rather than chaos? How can you step into conversations with people with a position and a posture? How can you bring a little piece of heaven to earth with you this week, wherever you go? And as the band plays, we're going to have opportunity to pray. We're going to have friends that'll be up on both sides like we do week after week. It's an opportunity to pray with you. If you need prayer, they'd love to pray with you before you go. But as the band plays, process, God, how do you want me to put this into practice this week?